I shouldn't have stopped that night, but something in me refused to keep driving. The rain came down in sheets, blurring the road ahead into streaks of silver and shadow, my windshield wipers fighting a losing battle as I gripped the steering wheel tighter than I needed to, the clock on my dashboard reading 11:42 p.m. and the gas gauge hovering just above empty. The kind of night where most people just wanted to get home, lock the door, and forget the world existed, and I was no different until I saw him. A figure on the side of the road, near a flickering streetlight, barely visible through the storm. One hand braced against a black SUV that looked expensive even under layers of rain. The other pressed against his side like he was holding himself together by sheer will. And I remember thinking this wasn't my problem, that I had exactly $12 in my account, a rent payment overdue by 2 weeks, and a double shift waiting for me in less than 8 hours. But my foot hit the brake before my mind could catch up, the tires sliding just a little on the wet asphalt before the car stopped 10 feet ahead of him. And for a second, I just sat there, heart pounding, watching him through the rearview mirror, telling myself to drive away, that someone else would help, that I couldn't afford to get involved in whatever situation had left a man stranded like that in the middle of nowhere. But then he lifted his head, and even through the rain, even in the dim light, I saw his eyes, sharp, alert, not scared but calculating, like he was measuring the world, even while standing on the edge of it. And something about that look made me open the door before I could talk myself out of it. The cold air hitting my face as rain soaked through my jacket in seconds, my sneakers splashing through shallow puddles as I walked toward him, each step louder than it should have been in the quiet stretch of empty road. "Hey," I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. "You okay?" And he didn't answer right away. Just watched me approach like I was something unexpected, something that didn't fit into whatever plan he had running in his head. And up close, I could see the details, the tailored coat now darkened with rain, the expensive watch on his wrist catching a brief glint of light, the way he stood despite the strain, straight-backed, controlled, like falling wasn't an option he allowed himself. "You shouldn't be out here," he said finally, his voice low, calm, carrying a kind of authority that didn't need to be loud to be heard. And I almost laughed because it was the most ridiculous thing anyone could say given the situation. "Neither should you." I shot back, stepping closer despite the way my instincts whispered caution, pulling off my scarf and holding it out without thinking too hard about it. "Here, you're freezing." And for a moment he just stared at the fabric in my hand like it meant something more than it did, like it was a question he hadn't expected to answer, before taking it slowly, his fingers brushing mine for the briefest second, warm despite the cold, steady despite everything else. And I told myself it didn't matter who he was, that he was just a stranger who needed help, that whatever sharp edge lived in his gaze wasn't my concern. So I moved past it, glancing at the SUV, at the empty road stretching in both directions, at the absence of headlights or movement anywhere nearby. "My car's still running," I said, nodding back toward my beat-up sedan. "I can give you a ride, at least get you somewhere safe." And again that pause, that careful silence, like he was weighing the offer against something invisible, something bigger than just a ride from a stranger on a rainy night. And when he finally nodded, it felt less like agreement and more like a decision that would echo longer than either of us understood. And I didn't realize then that this simple choice, this moment I almost drove past, would change everything, not because of who he was, but because of what he would decide I deserved after it was over. I kept my eyes on the road as he settled into the passenger seat, the door closing with a solid, expensive sound that did not belong in a car like mine, the kind of car that rattled if you pushed it past 50 miles per hour and still smelled faintly like burnt coffee from a spill I never fully cleaned up. And for a moment neither of us spoke, just the steady rhythm of rain against the roof and the low hum of the engine filling the silence. And I told myself that was normal, that strangers did not owe each other conversation, that this was just a ride, nothing more. But the air felt different, heavier, like something unseen had shifted the second he stepped inside. "Where to?" I finally asked, glancing at him for a split second before looking back at the road. And he gave an address that sounded more like a landmark than a home, something on the north side of the city I had only ever driven past, the kind of place with tall gates and security cameras. And I nodded like it was nothing, like I drove people there all the time, even though I knew I did not belong anywhere near it. It is about 15 miles from here, he added, his voice calm, measured, as if distance did not matter, as if time bent differently for him. And I pressed the gas a little harder, merging back onto the road, my tires hissing against the wet pavement as we moved through the empty stretch of highway. And I could feel his gaze on me, not intrusive, not uncomfortable, just present, like he was studying something he did not quite understand, and it made me hyper-aware of everything. The way my hands tightened on the wheel, the way my hair stuck to my cheeks from the rain, the way my jacket dripped onto the seat beneath me. "You always stop for strangers?" he asked after a minute. And there was something in the question that felt less like curiosity and more like a test, like the answer mattered more than it should, and I shrugged, keeping my tone light, even though my chest felt tight for reasons I could not explain. "Not always," I said. "Just when it feels wrong not to." And he let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but not quite, like the idea did not fit into his world. Like kindness without a price tag was something unfamiliar. "That is a dangerous habit," he said, and I smiled a little at that, shaking my head. "So is standing alone in the rain," I replied, and that earned me silence again, but it was a different kind this time. Less guarded, more thoughtful, like I had said something he would remember later. And the miles passed quicker than I expected, the city lights growing brighter as we got closer, buildings rising out of the darkness like something out of another life. One that had nothing to do with overdue bills or secondhand furniture or counting every dollar twice before spending it. And when we turned onto a private road lined with trees and subtle lighting, I felt it, that quiet shift again, like I had crossed an invisible line into a world that was not meant for people like me. And the gates ahead opened before I even slowed down. No security guard, no questions, just recognition. Like the car itself had been expected, and I swallowed hard. Pulling up to a wide circular driveway in front of a house that was not really a house at all, but something bigger, cleaner, untouched by the kind of struggles I knew too well. And I put the car in park, the engine still running as I looked straight ahead. Unsure if I should say anything. Unsure if this was where the story ended. "You can drop me here," he said, reaching for the door. But then he paused, his hand resting on the handle as he turned back to me. His eyes sharper now, more focused, like he had come to a conclusion about something. "You helped me tonight," he continued, his voice quieter but somehow heavier. "Most people would have kept driving," and I shrugged again, forcing a small smile because I did not want this to become something bigger than it was. "Then I guess most people were not there," I said, and he studied me for a long second, like he was trying to memorize something he could not afford to forget, before nodding once, slow and deliberate. "What is your name?" he asked, and I hesitated for half a second, not because I was afraid, but because it felt like giving him my name meant something I could not define, something that would not end when I drove away. "Lily," I said finally, my voice softer than before, and he repeated it under his breath, like it carried weight, like it mattered. "Lily." And then he stepped out into the rain, closing the door behind him, and I waited just long enough to make sure he got inside before putting the car in reverse, telling myself that was it, that whatever had just happened would fade into the background of my life like everything else, that I would go home, sleep for a few hours, and wake up to the same problems I always had. But as I drove away, I could not shake the feeling that I had just stepped into something I did not understand, something that would not let me walk away as easily as I thought. I thought that would be the end of it, just another strange story I would never tell anyone because it sounded too unreal to explain. But the next morning proved me wrong before I even had time to finish my first cup of coffee, the kind that tasted more like survival than comfort, sitting in a chipped mug at the small diner where I worked, my shift starting at 6 in the morning sharp, my body running on maybe 3 hours of sleep and stubborn determination, and everything felt normal again. The clatter of plates, the low hum of conversation, the smell of bacon and fresh toast filling the air, grounding me in a life that made sense, until the door opened and 3 men walked in, all wearing dark coats that did not belong in a place like this, too clean, too precise, like they had stepped out of a different world entirely. And I noticed the way the room shifted, not dramatically, not enough for anyone to panic, just a subtle change in energy, conversations lowering a notch, eyes glancing then quickly looking away, like instinct recognized something before logic could explain it. And I told myself they were just customers, that people with money could eat anywhere they wanted, that I was overthinking it. But then one of them walked straight toward me, not toward a table, not toward the counter, but directly toward me, and my stomach tightened before he even spoke. "Lily Brooks?" he asked, his voice polite but firm, and hearing my full name from a stranger at 7 in. The morning made something in my chest go still, like the world had paused just long enough for me to realize I was no longer in control of this situation. "That depends," I said, trying to keep my tone steady, wiping my hands on my apron as I faced him. "Who is asking?" And he gave a small, almost respectful nod, like he expected that question, like he approved of it even, before reaching into his coat and pulling out a small envelope, clean, unmarked, and holding it out to me with both hands. "Mr. Hayes asked us to deliver this to you," he said, and the name hit me a second later. Dominic, the man from the night before, the one I had left behind at those gates, the one I had already convinced myself I would never see again, and I stared at the envelope like it was something fragile, something that could break open more than just paper if I touched it. "What is it?" I asked, even though I already had a feeling I knew, and the man did not hesitate. A gesture of appreciation, he replied, and I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it felt so out of place in my life. Appreciation did not usually come in envelopes. It came in tips that barely covered gas money, in thank yous that people forgot 5 minutes later, not in something delivered by men who looked like they belonged in boardrooms instead of diners. And slowly, carefully, I took the envelope, my fingers brushing against the smooth surface as I opened it just enough to see what was inside, and my breath caught before I could stop it. A stack of bills, more than I had seen in one place in a long time, maybe ever, and for a second, just 1 second, I imagined what it could fix: the rent, the overdue notices, the constant weight of never having enough. But just as quickly, something in me pushed back, something stubborn and quiet but unshakable, and I closed the envelope, pressing it back into the man's hand. "No," I said, shaking my head once, firm this time. "I cannot take this." And his expression did not change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, surprise maybe, or confusion, like this was not how the script was supposed to go. "Miss Brooks," he began, but I cut him off gently, holding my ground even as every practical thought in my head screamed that I was making a mistake. I helped him because he needed help, I said, my voice steady now, stronger than I felt, not because I wanted anything in return. And for a moment, the space between us felt charged, not with tension, but with something quieter, something like understanding trying to find its place. And the man studied me carefully, like he was committing this moment to memory for someone else, before nodding once, slowly. "Very well," he said, taking the envelope back without argument, without pressure, just acceptance. And as they turned to leave, the diner seemed to breathe again, conversations picking back up, the world slipping into its usual rhythm like nothing had happened. But I stood there for a second longer than I should have, my hands resting on the counter, my heart beating just a little faster than normal, because deep down, I knew something had shifted again, not because I took the money, but because I refused it. And somehow, that felt like the kind of decision that did not end when the door closed behind them. The rest of that shift felt longer than usual, like time had slowed down just enough to make me aware of every second passing, every small detail pressing into my thoughts, the clink of silverware, the low murmur of customers, the way the sunlight filtered through the front windows and turned everything a soft shade of gold that should have felt comforting but did not anymore, because my mind kept drifting back to that envelope, to the weight of it in my hands, to the look in that man's eyes when I gave it back, like I had broken a rule I did not even know existed. And I tried to shake it off, telling myself I did the right thing, that taking money for something like that would have changed it, would have turned a simple moment into something transactional, something less honest. But doubt has a quiet way of slipping in when you are already tired, already stretched thin, and by the time my shift ended, my feet ached, my head felt heavy, and the reality of my life settled back. And like it always did, waiting for me just outside the door, my car still low on gas, my phone buzzing with a notification I did not need to check to know what it was, another reminder about rent, another number I could not meet yet, and I exhaled slowly, leaning against the side of my car for a second before unlocking it, staring at the chipped paint, the small dent on the passenger door, the things I had stopped noticing because they were just part of my normal, and I wondered, just for a second, what it would feel like to not have to think about any of it, to not have to calculate every choice, every dollar, every risk. But that thought passed as quickly as it came, replaced by something steadier, something that reminded me who I was, that I did not help people because I expected something back, that I could not start changing that now just because it was hard. And I slid into the driver's seat, turning the key and letting the engine hum to life. But before I could pull out of the parking lot, something caught my attention, a black sedan parked across the street, not moving, not idling loudly, just there. And maybe I would not have noticed it on any other day. Maybe I would have just driven away without a second thought. But after everything that had happened, after the night before, after this morning, I found myself watching it for a moment longer than necessary, my fingers tightening slightly on the steering wheel. And then, as if sensing my attention, the car pulled away smoothly, merging into traffic without hesitation, without drawing attention, like it had never been there at all. And a chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the weather, not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that settles in when you realize something unseen is moving around you, something you cannot fully understand yet. And I told myself I was imagining things, that coincidence was still a thing, that not everything had meaning. But deep down, I knew better, because the truth was simple and impossible to ignore. Dominic Hayes was not the kind of man who let things end on someone else's terms. And I had just given him something he did not expect, something he could not categorize or control, and people like that did not walk away from unanswered questions. They followed them. They studied them. They turned them over until they made sense. And for the first time since that night on the road, I realized that helping him had not been the moment. That changed everything. Refusing him had been. And as I drove out of the lot, the city stretching out in front of me, busy and indifferent, I could not shake the feeling that somewhere behind the scenes, something had already begun to shift, quietly, deliberately, in ways I would not see until it was too late to step back. The next few days settled into something that looked normal on the surface, but felt slightly off underneath, like a song playing just a fraction too slow. Everything familiar, yet not quite the same. And I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the things I could control, my shifts at the diner, the stack of unpaid bills on my kitchen counter, the routine that had always kept me steady. But small things kept catching my attention, details that should have meant nothing but refused to disappear. Once I noticed them, like the way my gas tank was suddenly full when I knew I had barely enough to get to work the night before, or how the flickering light outside my apartment building that had been broken for weeks was suddenly fixed, casting a clean, steady glow over the parking lot as if it had never been an issue at all. And I told myself there were explanations for everything. That maybe the landlord finally did something. That maybe I had misremembered how much gas I had. But deep down, a quiet voice kept asking the same question. What if it was not a coincidence? What if it was him? And I hated that thought more than I expected, not because it scared me, but because it unsettled something in me that I had always relied on. The idea that my life, as difficult as it was still mine, still something I navigated on my own terms, and the idea that someone else could step in, unseen, and start adjusting things without asking felt like a line being crossed, even if the changes were helpful, even if they made things easier. And that realization followed me into work, into every interaction, into the way I started noticing the same black sedan more than once, never too close, never obvious, just present enough that I could not fully dismiss it. And I tried to push it away, tried to focus on the immediate, on the sound of the coffee machine, on the orders I had to take, on the customers who came and went without knowing anything about the quiet shift happening just outside their awareness, until something happened that I could not explain away, not this time, not with logic or coincidence, because when I checked my schedule posted behind the counter, the one I had memorized days ago, the one that had me working every double shift this week just to keep up with rent, it was different. My name was still there, but the hours had changed, shorter shifts, more time off, the kind of schedule I had asked for weeks ago and been denied without hesitation, and I stared at it longer than I should have, my fingers brushing against the paper like it might reveal something hidden if I looked close enough. They updated it this morning, my manager said from behind me, his tone casual, like this was no big deal, like schedules changed all the time. And I turned to him slowly, trying to keep my expression neutral even as my thoughts raced. Why? I asked, and he shrugged, not meeting my eyes. Owner's decision. He replied, already moving on to something else, like the answer was enough, like I should not question it further, but I did, because this was not random anymore. This was deliberate, precise, targeted, and I could feel it, the same quiet control I had sensed in Dominic that night, the same way he observed before he acted, the same patience. And for the first time since this all started, I felt something close to frustration rise up inside me, because this was not a reward I had accepted. This was not something I had agreed to, and yet it was happening anyway, woven into my life in ways that were subtle enough to avoid confrontation, but obvious enough to change everything. And as I stepped outside for a break, the cool air hitting my face, I looked across the street again, half expecting to see that same car, and this time, it was there, parked like it had every right to be. And instead of looking away, instead of pretending I did not notice, I held my gaze on it, steady, unflinching, because if there was one thing I understood now, it was this: Dominic Hayes had not accepted my answer, and whatever he was doing, whatever quiet adjustments he was making behind the scenes, this was only the beginning of something much bigger than I had ever intended to be part of. I did not wait for coincidence to explain itself this time, because by the next morning, I had already decided that if something was happening around me, I was going to face it directly, not tiptoe around it like it might disappear if I ignored it. And that decision sat heavy in my chest as I stepped out of my apartment building, the early air cool and sharp against my skin, the sky still painted in that soft gray before sunrise, the kind of quiet that usually made me feel calm, grounded, but not today. Today it felt like a pause, like the world was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next, and I knew exactly where to look before I even reached my car, my eyes moving across the street with a certainty that made my pulse quicken just a little, and there it was again, the same black sedan, parked in the same almost invisible way, not too close, not too far, like it belonged there without actually belonging. And this time, I did not hesitate. I did not pretend I had not seen it. I crossed the street directly, my footsteps steady even as every instinct reminded me that I was stepping into something I did not fully understand. And when I stopped a few feet from the driver's side window, I tapped on the glass once, firm enough to be heard, and for a second, nothing happened, just my reflection staring back at me, slightly distorted. Rain clouds gathering again overhead like they were drawn to this moment. And then the window lowered smoothly, revealing a man I recognized from the diner. One of the three who had delivered the envelope, his expression calm, almost respectful, like he had expected this eventually. Like this confrontation had been part of the plan all along. "You have been following me," I said, not a question, my voice quieter than I expected but steady, controlled, and he did not deny it, did not offer excuses or deflection, just met my gaze evenly. "We have been ensuring your safety," he replied, his tone measured, like each word had been chosen carefully, and I let out a short breath, something between disbelief and frustration, shaking my head slightly. "I did not ask for that," I said, and the words felt more important than anything else I could have said in that moment, because this was not about the car or the schedule or the small changes that kept appearing in my life. This was about control, about choice, about the line I had drawn when I refused that envelope. And he nodded once, like he understood, like he respected the boundary, even as he stood on the other side of it. "Mr. Hayes understands that," he said. And I almost laughed at that, because if Dominic Hayes understood it, he was not showing it in any way that mattered. Then why is this still happening? I asked, gesturing slightly, not just at the car, but at everything, the invisible adjustments, the quiet interference, the feeling that my life was being rewritten in ways I had not agreed to. And for the first time, there was a flicker of something in the man's expression, not discomfort, not fear, but something closer to honesty. "Because he does not see it as interference," he answered. "He sees it as responsibility." And that word landed differently than the others, heavier, more personal, like it carried a meaning I was only beginning to understand. And I stood there for a moment, letting it settle, letting the implications unfold in my mind. Because responsibility meant obligation. It meant ownership in a way that I was not comfortable with. Not from someone like him. Not in a situation like this. and I took a step back, drawing a slow breath, grounding myself before I spoke again. "Tell him this," I said, my voice firm now, clearer than it had been since this all started. "I do not need him to fix my life. I do not need protection, and I do not need a reward. I helped him because it was the right thing to do, and that does not come with conditions." And the man listened without interrupting, without arguing, just absorbing every word like it mattered, like it would be repeated exactly as I said it. And when I finished, he gave a small nod. "I will tell him," he said simply, and I believed him. Not because I trusted him, but because something about this entire situation told me that my words would reach Dominic Hayes exactly as intended. And as I turned and walked back to my car, the weight in my chest shifted slightly, not gone, but different, because I had said what I needed to say. I had drawn the line again, clearer this time, stronger. And yet, as I drove away, I could not shake the feeling that lines like that did not stop men like him. They only made them look closer, think deeper, and decide, in their own way, what mattered more, my choice or his. I expected something to change after that, something immediate, like a reaction, a pushback, some sign that my words had landed the way I intended them to. But the next 2 days passed in a strange kind of silence, not empty, not normal, just still, like the world had paused around me again, waiting, watching, and that unsettled me more than anything else had so far, because at least before, there had been movement, small adjustments I could point to, things I could question, but now there was nothing. No black sedan across the street when I left my apartment, no unexpected changes to my schedule, no quiet fixes appearing overnight, just my life, exactly as it had been before all of this started. And I told myself that was what I wanted, that this was proof I had drawn the line clearly enough, that whatever control Dominic Hayes thought he had chosen to respect my decision. But the relief I expected never came, because absence can be just as loud as presence when you are paying attention, and I found myself noticing everything again. The flicker returning to the hallway light in my building, the gas gauge dropping faster than I would have liked, the weight of my bank balance pressing in the back of my mind like it always did. And for a moment, I almost missed the quiet ease that had slipped in before, and that realization made me stop in the middle of my kitchen, one hand resting on the counter, my thoughts catching up to me in a way that felt uncomfortable and honest at the same time. Because it meant I had noticed, it meant part of me had felt the difference, even if I had not wanted to admit it, and I pushed that thought aside quickly, grabbing my jacket and heading out for my evening shift, determined to stay grounded, to keep things simple, to remind myself that my life was still mine, still something I navigated step by step without anyone else stepping in to change it. And the diner was busy that night, louder than usual, filled with the kind of restless energy that came with a long day finally winding down, people talking over each other, plates moving in and out of the kitchen, the steady rhythm of work, pulling me back into something familiar, something safe, until it happened, small at first, almost easy to miss if I had not been paying attention. A customer at table 6 arguing over a bill that was clearly wrong, his frustration sharp but controlled, the kind that builds quietly instead of exploding. And I stepped in before it could escalate, my voice calm, steady, apologizing for the mistake even though I had not made it, offering to fix it, to take care of it, because that is what I did. That is what this job required, smoothing over problems that were never really mine. And it should have ended there, just another interaction, another moment that would fade into the background. But something shifted in the man's expression when I spoke, something that made him pause, really pause, like he was reassessing the situation, like the tension had somewhere to go that was not outward anymore. And after a second, he nodded, the edge in his voice softening as he accepted the correction. Without pushing further, and I moved on, thinking nothing of it until I noticed the manager watching from behind the counter, his usual impatience gone, replaced by something closer to approval. And later, when the rush slowed and I checked the system, I saw it, the bill already adjusted, the complaint logged as resolved without penalty, no note. No issue, just handled, smoothly, cleanly. And I stood there for a second, staring at the screen, that same quiet awareness settling in again, not as obvious as before, not as direct, but present, subtle, controlled, like a hand guiding things just enough to keep them from breaking. And for the first time, I understood something I had not before this. was not about forcing change into my life. This was about removing the weight that kept pressing down on it, not loudly, not visibly, just enough to make a difference without asking for recognition. And as I stepped outside at the end of my shift, the night air cool and steady around me, I realized that silence had not meant he stopped. It meant he had adjusted, and somehow, that made everything more complicated than it had been before, because it meant Dominic Hayes was still there, still, watching, just in a way that made it harder to say no. I did not expect to see him again, not like this, not in a way that erased every layer of distance I had been trying to maintain, because up until that moment, Dominic Hayes had been a presence without a face, a force that moved quietly around my life without stepping directly into it, something I could argue against in theory, even if I could not fully escape it in reality. But that changed the night the diner closed early because of a plumbing issue that sent half the staff home before midnight, leaving me standing outside with my jacket pulled tight against the cool air, my breath visible in the dim glow of the streetlights, trying to decide whether to drive home or walk the few blocks just to clear my head. And that was when I noticed the car, not across the street this time, not hidden, not pretending to be something it was not, but parked directly in front of the diner like it had every right to be there, like it belonged in my world just as much as I did, and my steps slowed without me meaning them to, my pulse picking up in a way that felt both familiar and entirely new. Because I knew before the door even opened who was inside, and when it did, when he stepped out into the light, everything else seemed to fall away for a second. The sound of passing cars, the distant hum of the city, even the cold air against my skin, all of it fading behind the simple reality of him standing there, composed, controlled, exactly as I remembered, but sharper somehow more. Defined now that I was seeing him without rain or distance softening the edges, and I stopped a few feet away. Not moving closer, not stepping back, just holding that space between us like it mattered. Like it was the only thing keeping this from becoming something I could not take back. You should not be here, I said, my voice quieter than I intended but steady enough to carry, and his expression did not change, not surprised, not offended, just attentive, like he had expected resistance and accepted it before it even happened. You are right, he replied, his tone calm, almost thoughtful, but I am here anyway. And something about the simplicity of that answer made it harder to argue. Because it was not defensive, not forceful, just a statement of fact, and I crossed my arms slightly, more to ground myself than anything else. I told your people to stop, I said, meeting his gaze directly, refusing to look away even though there was something in his eyes that made it difficult to hold for too long, not threatening, just intense, like he was seeing more than I was saying. They did, he answered, and for a second, I almost believed him, because in a way, they had. The obvious things had stopped, the visible presence had disappeared, but that did not mean everything had ended, and he seemed to read that thought before I could speak it. I adjusted. He continued, and there it was again, that wordless understanding, that quiet admission that he had not stepped away, he had simply changed how he moved. And I let out a slow breath, shaking my head slightly. That is not the same thing, I said, and this time, there was the faintest shift in his expression. Not irritation, not impatience, just acknowledgement, like he recognized the truth in what I said even if he did not agree with it. No, he admitted, it is not. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, the space between us filled with everything that had happened and everything that had not been said yet. And I realized something then, something that had been building quietly in the background of all of this. He was not here to convince me, not in the way I expected. He was here because he had decided something that did not depend on my approval, and that realization settled into my chest like a weight I could not ignore. Why? I asked finally, the question simple but carrying everything I needed to understand, and he looked at me for a long second before answering, like the truth required more precision than most things. Because you did something no one else would have done, he said, his voice lower now, steadier, and you asked for nothing in return. And I felt my jaw tighten slightly, not because I disagreed, but because that was exactly why this did not make sense to me. That does not mean you owe me anything, I replied, and he held my gaze, unwavering. I do not owe you, he said, and for a split second, I thought that was it, that he understood, that this would end here, but then he continued, I choose to, and that was the difference. That was the line I could not argue against in the same way, because it was not obligation, it was decision, and decisions like that were harder to stop, harder to redirect. And as I stood there, the night stretching out around us, I realized that whatever this was, whatever line I had tried to draw, he had already stepped across it, not forcefully, not recklessly, but deliberately, and somehow, that made it even harder to push him back. For a moment, I did not know what to say, because there was something disarming about the way he stood there, not pushing, not demanding, just present in a way that made everything feel more real than it had before. And I realized that this was the first time since all of this started that I was not reacting to something unseen, not guessing at intentions or tracing quiet changes back to an invisible source. This time he was here, in front of me, and whatever this was between us, it was no longer something I could ignore or simplify. And I took a slow breath, letting the cold air steady me before I spoke again. You cannot just decide things for me, I said, my voice calm but firm, because that mattered, because if I let that slip even a little, I knew this would turn into something I could not control. And he nodded slightly, like he had expected that, like he respected it even. I am not deciding for you, he replied, his tone even. I am deciding what I do. And that distinction settled in my mind in a way that was frustrating and clear at the same time, because it meant he was not trying to take anything from me, not directly, but he was still shaping the space around me in ways that made it harder to stay exactly where I was. And I looked at him for a second longer, searching for something in his expression that would make this easier to understand, something that would let me categorize him as one thing or another, but there was nothing simple there, nothing I could reduce to a single idea. Just that same steady focus, that same quiet certainty, and it made me realize that this was not about convincing him to stop, not in the way I had been trying to do it, because people like Dominic Hayes did not operate on permission, they operated on intention, and his intention was not changing. Then listen to me, I said, stepping a little closer without fully meaning to, my voice lower now, more personal. I do not want my life fixed. I do not want things handed to me. I have worked for everything I have, even if it is not much, and that matters to me. And this time, when he looked at me, there was something different in his eyes, not softer, but deeper, like he was actually considering what I was saying instead of just hearing it. And he held that silence for a few seconds before responding, choosing his words carefully. And I am not taking that from you, he said. I am making sure the world does not take more than it should. And that hit differently than everything else he had said. Because it was not about giving, not about rewarding, it was about balance, about removing what should not have been there in the first place. And for the first time, I hesitated, not because I agreed, but because I could not immediately argue against it. And that pause seemed to matter, because he took a step back then, not closer, not pushing further into my space, just enough to show that he was not trying to corner me into anything. You helped me when you did not have to, he continued, his voice steady. You walked away when you could have asked for anything, and you chose not to. And I swallowed slightly, the memory of that night flashing through my mind. The rain, the road, the moment that had felt so simple at the time and now felt like the start of something I still did not fully understand. So this is not about a reward, he added, and there was a finality in that statement that made me listen more closely. It is about recognition, and I frowned slightly at that. Because recognition was not something I had ever expected, not something I had ever needed. I do not need that either, I said quietly. And for the first time since he stepped out of that car, there was the faintest hint of something almost like a smile at the corner of his mouth. Not amusement, not dismissal, just acknowledgement, like he had already anticipated that answer. I know, he said. And that was the part that changed everything. Not because it solved anything, but because it meant he understood the difference. He understood that I was not asking for anything, that I did not want anything, and he had chosen to act anyway. And as I stood there, the distance between us no longer feeling like a barrier, but something more complicated, I realized that this was never going to be a simple yes or no, a clear acceptance or rejection. This was something that existed in between, something shaped by both of us in ways neither of us fully controlled. And as he turned to leave, stepping back toward his car without waiting for another response, he paused just long enough to say one more thing, his voice quieter now, but carrying the same weight as everything else. You did not want anything in return, he said. But that does not mean you did not deserve something better, and I watched him drive away, the sound of the engine fading into the night. And for the first time since this all began, I was not sure if what I was feeling was resistance or something else entirely. Something that felt a little too close to understanding.